20 minutes earlier, Reed Ashford sat at the head of a table in a windowless room beneath the basement of Sonare, his restaurant in Chicago. 4 men sat around the table, but only one of them was trying to swallow and failing. Reed didn't raise his voice, didn't slam his fist. He asked one question, quiet as ordering lunch, and the man across from him forgot how to breathe. 20 minutes later, he was standing in the staff break room of the very restaurant he owned, a room with a plastic table, a chair missing one leg, and a coffee machine the entire floor had given up on. He was holding the worst cup of coffee he'd ever tasted in his life, and listening to a girl laugh. She was laughing because a stray cat in the alley had jumped into a dumpster and gotten stuck inside. The sound filled the tiny room, and Reed Ashford, the man whose voice could silence an empire, stood there holding a cold cup of coffee, with absolutely nothing to say. He didn't know her name. She didn't know who he was. And that was the last minute in 7 years that Reed Ashford could honestly say he was still in control. If this story touched you, hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, because next week, another powerful man is about to kneel, and the reason is even crazier. She looked up. She didn't startle, didn't rise, didn't hurry to fix the way she was sitting as though she had just been caught being lazy. She only lifted her head, looked straight at the man in the 3-piece suit standing in the middle of the staff break room like a note played out of key, and asked, "Did you get lost on the wrong floor? Or in the wrong profession?" Reed opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the past 7 years, he had sat across from men who traded whole cities, from lawyers 2 decades older than he was, from partners willing to swallow one another alive at the negotiating table. No one had ever asked him a question he didn't already have at least 3 answers for. Not until tonight. "I'm looking for something," he said, and the moment the words left his mouth, he knew how foolish they sounded. She arched a brow. "In the staff break room? The only thing worth looking for here is a chair with all its legs intact. And that we don't have." She nudged the plastic chair across from her toward him with the tip of her shoe. "Want to sit? It leans a little to the left, but if you shift your weight to the right, you'll survive." Reed sat down. He didn't know why he sat. He had an appointment in the VIP room upstairs in less than 2 hours, with the Whitmore family, with a young woman his mother and an entire machinery of arrangement had chosen for him 4 seasons ago. He had a schedule. He always had a schedule. But he sat down in the chair that leaned to the left, and the girl across from him poured him a second cup from the rusted relic that no one else dared to touch, as though a stranger in a suit sitting in the staff break room was the sort of thing that happened every night. "I'm Jolene," she said. No last name, no explanation. Just a name, set down on the table as lightly as a paper napkin. "Reed," he answered. No last name either. And he realized this was the first time in 7 years he had introduced himself without the family name attached. She didn't ask what he did for a living. She didn't ask why he had come here. She spoke the way people do when they're used to having no time for circling around anything. The night shift started at 8 o'clock, ended at 3 o'clock in the morning. She got home at 4 o'clock, slept until 8 o'clock, then opened her laptop to take freelance design work, worked until afternoon, ate the one proper meal of the day, and then went right back to work. 4 hours of sleep, she said, not complaining, only speaking as though she were reading the weather. Enough not to collapse into a drink tray, not enough to dream. Reed listened. He couldn't remember the last time he had listened to someone speak without having to sort through which sentence was true and which one was calculation. This girl wasn't calculating. Not because she was naive, quite the opposite. She spoke plainly because she had nothing to lose, and she knew it, and she wasn't ashamed of it. Reed was thinking that he could sit here another 15 minutes, and no one would find him when the break room door flew open. The restaurant manager stood in the doorway, face drained white, eyes wide as if he had just seen a ghost sitting there drinking coffee. "Mr. Ashford, sir, I didn't know you were." The sentence died in midair. The manager looked at Jolene, looked at Reed, looked at the plastic cup of coffee in the hand of the man who owned this entire restaurant, and 17 other businesses spread across Chicago, and he looked as though he wanted the ground to open and swallow him whole. Jolene looked at the manager, then at Reed. She said nothing for about 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds, Reed felt as clearly as he felt the chair tilting beneath him. She was putting the pieces together. "Ashford. Sir. The owner. The plastic cup of coffee. The staff break room." She finished fitting them together. Her face didn't change. She didn't go pale, didn't flush, didn't stand up and bow her head. She only tilted her head a little to one side, looked at him with the expression of someone who had just turned over a card no one expected, and said, "So you own that coffee machine too? Now you understand why the whole floor gave up on it, don't you?" The restaurant manager looked as though he was about to faint. Reed didn't look at the manager. He looked at Jolene. And for the first time in many years, he laughed. Not the smile he used in boardrooms. Not the polite smile he used at parties. A real laugh, brief, breaking out of his chest before he could control it, as though his body had remembered a reflex his mind had forgotten a long time ago. He turned to the manager. "Move the appointment in the VIP room to next week. Call my assistant, and tell him to inform the Whitmores." The manager stood there for another 2 seconds, mouth slightly open, then nodded and withdrew so quickly it was as if he had never appeared at all. Jolene watched him go, then turned back to Reed. "You just canceled an appointment over the worst cup of coffee in Chicago?" "I canceled it because I want to sit here," Reed said, and he realized, as the words left his mouth, that this was the first time in 7 years he had said the word want, and truly meant it. Jolene didn't answer. She looked at him a moment longer, with a gaze it would take him many weeks to understand. It wasn't the look of calculation. It wasn't the look of fear. It was the look of someone who had grown used to reading other people in order to survive, and was reading him now, and still hadn't decided. "Then sit," she said. "But for the third cup, you pour it yourself. I don't work overtime for the boss." Reed returned to the Ashford estate at nearly 11 o'clock that night. The gatekeeper opened the gate without a word, because the Ashford family's gatekeeper was paid not to speak, and he was very good at doing exactly that. Reed passed through the main hall, past the grand staircase leading up to the bedrooms, past the east corridor where the light was still on in his mother's room, and he didn't stop at any of those places. He went straight down to the garage. The garage at the Ashford estate had space for 4 cars, but in the farthest corner, behind the black Cadillac he had never driven himself, there was something that didn't belong in that room. A carpenter's bench. Oak, the middle of the tabletop worn smooth with age, the 2 front legs darker than the 2 in back, from decades of facing the same direction. His father's bench. Reed took off his suit jacket, hung it over the door handle, rolled his shirt sleeves up to his elbows, and pulled a hand plane from the drawer beneath the bench. He set a plank of oak on the work surface. He had bought this piece of wood the week before, from a small woodworking shop on the outskirts of the city. Paid cash, used no real name, because Reed Ashford did not buy wood. Reed Ashford signed contracts, bought real estate, bought the silence of other people. Reed Ashford did not stand in a garage at midnight planing wood, but Douglas Ashford's son did. He planed, slowly, evenly, without looking down, exactly the way his father had taught him before everything changed. Each pass of the plane pushed away a thin, curling ribbon of wood that fell soundlessly onto the concrete floor. He didn't think, or rather, he thought in the only way his hands allowed. When the hands were working, the mind didn't run in circles. It moved straight ahead. He thought about the sound of laughter in the staff break room. He thought about the way that girl had looked at him after learning who he was, and still hadn't changed her tone, hadn't changed her eyes, hadn't changed the way she sat in the chair. He thought that over the past 7 years he had met hundreds of people, and every single one of them had changed at least one thing the moment they learned he was Reed Ashford. Their voice, their eyes, the way they sat, the way they held a glass, the way they chose their words. The girl in the staff break room had changed nothing at all, and that kept him awake more than any contract ever had. This was the secret he hid most carefully, not the meetings in the basement, not the numbers passing through accounts the tax office never saw. Reed Ashford's most dangerous secret was the carpenter's bench in the garage, the callus in the palm of his right hand that he always hid beneath gloves or beneath the edge of a conference table. The fact that the head of the largest family in Chicago stood planing wood at midnight like an ordinary carpenter, because it was the only way he could remember his father, without feeling that he was wearing the man's suit and playing a role his father had never lived long enough to teach him how to play. He planed until the board was smooth, then he stopped, wiped his hands, put the jacket back on, and went upstairs to his mother's room. His mother's room was still lit. Margaret Ashford sat propped against a careful mound of pillows on the bed, so thin that the blanket drawn across her chest seemed to be holding a thought rather than a person. But her eyes were bright. Her eyes were always bright. Her body was losing the battle, but her eyes still refused to sign any surrender. Reed closed the door and stood at the foot of the bed. He didn't sit. He stood the way he stood when he needed to ask a question he already knew the answer to. There wasn't any item in the staff room, was there, Mother? Margaret Ashford looked at him. She didn't blink. She had a habit of not blinking when she was asked something directly. Exactly like her husband. Exactly like her son. As though this whole family had been born with a bloodline that refused to blink first. No, she said. There wasn't any item. You sent me down to the staff room. I sent you down to the staff room. Reed drew in a breath. For the past 7 years, his mother had arranged many things. She arranged meetings he never knew had been staged. She arranged supposedly chance encounters at charity parties. She even arranged who sat beside whom at family dinners, in order to control the flow of information. Reed knew that. He knew it because he was like her. But tonight was different. Tonight she had not arranged a business meeting. She had arranged for her son to meet a night shift waitress. Margaret opened the drawer of her bedside table and took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters. Plain paper. Not the expensive stationery she usually used for formal letters. Paper she had torn from a notebook, the kind people used to write grocery lists. On it were 5 names. Just names. No surnames. Each name came with a handwritten note, the letters small and slanting to the right, the lines trembling slightly at the end of every word, because her hand was no longer as steady as it once had been. The first name was Jolene, the shortest note of all 5 names. Reed read that note, then read it again. Then folded the paper and set it down on the edge of the bed. You've been watching her, he said. Not a question. I've been observing her, Margaret corrected. Watching is your word, observing is mine. I've seen her. I know who she is. Reed waited. He knew his mother. She would say more, but in her rhythm, not in his. Margaret looked toward the window. Outside, the east garden lay sunk in darkness, where the wooden fence stood, the one Reed repaired himself every weekend, because she loved that garden, and he didn't want outsiders entering the house. Reed, she said, her voice softer now, as if she were using the part of her breath she had to ration day by day. Don't look her up. Don't call your assistant. Don't pull a file. Don't run a background check. Don't turn her into a stack of papers in one of your drawers. You've already turned enough people into files. Reed said nothing. Because she was right. You've kept everything your father left behind, Margaret went on. She looked back at him. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was not. You kept the empire, kept the family, kept the chair at the head of the table. You've been very good at keeping things, Reed. 7 years without losing a single one. She stopped, breathed. Every breath she took now was a conscious decision, no longer a reflex. But you still haven't built anything that is truly your own. The room fell still. Reed could hear the steady beeping of the breathing monitor on the bedside table, and the wind beyond the window, and the silence of all the things his mother didn't add, because she didn't need to. He made no promise. His mother hated promises. She said promises were what people used when they still didn't know what they were going to do, and she had not raised her son to become a man who didn't know what he was going to do. I'll go back to Sinar on Tuesday, Reed said. Margaret Ashford looked at him, then nodded. A small nod, sparing, like everything she had done in recent months. But Reed saw, at the corner of her mouth, the faintest curve, not enough to call a smile, but enough for him to know that folded sheet of paper had been written a long time ago. She had only been waiting for the exact right moment to hand it to him. In the second week, Reed was walking into Sinare at 7 o'clock in the evening, when his closest aide stopped him in the corridor behind the kitchen. This man never stopped Reed unless something worth stopping for had happened. Someone's watching the night shift waitress, the aide said in a low voice. Neil Whitmore's people. Reed didn't ask what kind of surveillance, since when, or how many men. He only needed one name, and now he had it. Neil Whitmore. Uncle to Paige Whitmore. The girl the Ashford family was arranging for Reed to marry in order to merge the business territories of the two sides. Neil had eyes and ears everywhere, including inside Reed's own restaurant. Someone at Sinare had reported it. The boss came 3 times a week, didn't sit in the VIP room, sat at the bar talking to the night shift waitress. A rumor like that only needed 2 days to reach Neil's ears. Reed fell silent. 5 seconds. His aide had worked with him long enough to know that 5 seconds of silence from Reed Ashford were more dangerous than 5 minutes of fire and shouting from anyone else. Tell Whitmore's people to stop, Reed said, his voice light, even, neither rising nor falling. The voice of a man reading a weather report that just happened to decide who would still be doing business in Chicago next week. If I have to say it a second time, I won't say it with words. The aide nodded and disappeared. Reed made one more call. He arranged for 2 security men around Jolene's apartment building, 24 hours a day, in shifts, discreetly. She wasn't to know. If she knew, she would ask why, and he didn't yet have any answer he could give her, without dragging in an entire world she wasn't ready to look at. That afternoon, during the regular meeting with his business allies, one of them raised the issue. Not directly, because no one at that table spoke directly to Reed, but the meaning was clear enough. The boss was spending time with a waitress, while there were business deals that needed closing, while the Whitmore family relationship needed maintaining, while an entire system was waiting for him to make a decision. Reed listened to the end. He didn't explain. He didn't argue. He only looked at the man who had spoken and said one sentence. I don't recall the last time anyone at this table asked me who I spend my time with. The meeting room fell silent. The kind of silence in which people could hear the clock on the wall, hear someone swallow, hear a pen rolling across the table because its owner had just let go of it. No one asked again. 7:30 in the evening. Reed walked into Sonari and sat at the bar, in the same spot where he always sat. Jolene was serving table 7. She saw him, gave a small nod. The kind of nod from someone familiar with a face but not yet familiar with a heart. Then turned back to her work. 10 minutes later, during her break, she sat down across from him with a cup of coffee from the new machine someone had quietly replaced, and said, "New coffee machine. No one knows who changed it. The whole floor is saying there's a kind ghost around here." Reed took a sip. "Is the coffee any better?" "Better. Still bad. But bad at an acceptable level now. Not at the level that makes you want to quit." And Reed, the man who an hour earlier had made an entire boardroom stop breathing, sat at the bar drinking coffee that was bad at an acceptable level, and felt that this was the only seat all day he truly wanted to sit in. Jolene Carter had been keeping a ledger in her head since she was 16. Not the romantic kind, not a diary written in purple ink with a silver lock. It was the kind of ledger kept by someone who didn't have the right to forget. How much this month's hospital bill cost. How much for electricity and water. How many days until the freelance design deadline. How many hours she had slept last night. She kept everything in her head, precise, tidy, arranged by priority, because she had learned that anything written on paper could be lost, but anything written in the mind followed her to sleep and woke up with her every morning. Over the past 3 weeks, Jolene's mental ledger had gained a new entry. She didn't give it a name. She only knew it sat in a place she couldn't control, between this month's hospital bill for her mother and whether to buy a new pair of shoes or wait another month. And it was taking up more and more space. Reed Ashford came to Sonari on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, as regular as a train schedule. He sat at the bar, in the same place, ordered coffee from the new machine that the entire staff was still whispering about, not knowing who had replaced it. Jolene knew who had replaced it. She didn't say. There were things she chose not to say. Not because she was good at keeping secrets, but because saying them would mean admitting she was paying attention, and she wasn't ready to admit that, not even to herself. Every 15-minute break, she sat across from him at the bar. They talked. Not the kind of talking that had a subject, a beginning and an end, someone leading and someone following. It was the kind where 2 people tossed lines back and forth like passing a ball, with no one keeping score. He asked what she had designed that day. She asked if anyone had forgotten how to breathe that day. He didn't answer that question, but his eyes smiled, and Jolene noted that his eyes smiled differently from his mouth. His mouth smiled when he wanted other people to see it. His eyes smiled when he forgot that anyone was watching. In those 3 weeks, Jolene recorded 2 entries in her mental ledger that she couldn't explain. The first entry was his hands. One Thursday evening, when Reed reached for his coffee, the sleeve of his shirt pulled back slightly, and Jolene saw the palm of his right hand. There was a callus, not the callus of someone who signed contracts, not the callus of someone who drove or played golf. It was the callus of someone who held tools, regularly, and long enough for the skin to build into a thick layer exactly where a hand wrapped around a handle. She asked. "Your hand," she said, offering no further explanation, because she knew he understood what she was asking. Reed looked down at his hand, then said, "Old habit." 2 words. A door closing. Jolene recorded it. A man who worked with his hands, and hid it. The second entry was the new employee. One Saturday night, a new server, less than 2 weeks into the job, carried a tray of drinks past the bar and tripped. The tray fell. 4 glasses shattered. Liquid splashed across the floor, onto chair legs, onto the shoes of 2 guests sitting nearby. The entire restaurant froze. Not because of the broken glasses, because the owner was sitting 3 steps away. Jolene saw the way every staff member within 10 meters turned toward Reed without fully turning, the sideways look of people waiting for thunder. The new server stood in the middle of broken glass, face pale, hands shaking. Reed stood up. He walked over to the server. He crouched down, picked up the larger shards of glass, and placed them on the tray, took a cloth from the bar and wiped the table, then looked at the server and spoke, loud enough for him to hear, quiet enough that the rest of the restaurant wouldn't. The first day I worked for my father, I spilled an entire pot of coffee on his table. He looked at me, then at the pot, then said, "Next time spill it on your opponent's table, less of a waste of coffee." I'm still here. You will be too. Then he sat back down, picked up his coffee, drank, as if nothing had happened. The restaurant exhaled. The new server went into the kitchen with an empty tray and shoulders lighter than they had been 30 seconds before. And Jolene, standing behind the bar, wrote in her mental ledger, "Not the behavior of an ordinary powerful man. An ordinary powerful man wouldn't stand up, or if he did, he would stand to order someone else to clean it. This man stood up and cleaned it himself. Then told a story about his father so a new employee would stop shaking. Then sat down and drank his coffee as if he had done nothing at all." Jolene didn't know where to file that. That was the problem. 4 years ago, another man had made her unsure where to place him as well. That man had promised a great deal, then left. Since then, Jolene had one rule: don't trust anyone who makes promises. That rule had kept her safe for 4 years. But Reed Ashford made no promises at all. He came, sat, drank coffee, talked, then left. Not a single promise. Not a single "I will." Not once had he said, "Trust me." And that was exactly the problem. Because Jolene's rule had been designed to defend against promises. She had no rule to defend against the patient silence of a man who simply came, sat, and stayed. She was breaking her own rule without anything to blame. There was no promise to point at and say, "There, I was warned." There was only a callus in the palm of a hand she couldn't explain. A new employee steadied without being asked. And 3 evenings a week she had started counting down to. Reed invited her at the end of the 3rd week. Not to a party, not to an event. He simply said, during her break on Saturday night, in the voice of a man weighing each word before letting it go, "My mother would like to meet you. She can't go out. If you agree, I'll send a car for you." Jolene didn't answer at once. She finished her coffee, set the cup down, then said, "I can get there myself. Give me the address." The Ashford estate stood in the heart of the Gold Coast, 15 minutes by car from Jolene's apartment, and an entire ocean away in every other sense. Jolene stepped through the iron gates, looked at the gray stone facade, and said nothing. She wasn't overwhelmed. Or if she was, she hid it better than anyone Reed had ever brought into this house. She looked, took it in, and kept walking. With the step of someone who had learned that comparing her home to someone else's was a game with no winner. Reed led her up to the 2nd floor. He stopped before a white door with a brass handle and said quietly, "She's very tired today. She'll apologize for not being able to stand. Don't accept the apology too quickly. She hates being treated like an invalid." Jolene nodded. He opened the door. Margaret Ashford lay in bed, smaller than Jolene had imagined. Powerful people always looked smaller in a sickbed than the shadow they cast across the world. And Margaret was no different. But when she turned her head to look at Jolene, her eyes were not small. Her eyes read Jolene from head to toe in about 2 seconds. Not in the way of judging clothes or appearance, but in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime reading other people, and was now reading quickly, because she knew she didn't have much time left to read slowly. "Sit down, Jolene," she said. Not Miss Jolene, not dear, not young lady, only her name. Jolene sat in the chair beside the bed. Reed stood at the door in silence, like a man long accustomed to standing at the door of his mother's room and waiting. "My son speaks of you very little," Margaret said. "That's a good sign. He only says very little about the things he truly cares about. The things that don't matter, he can talk about for an hour." Jolene didn't know how to answer that. Margaret didn't need her to answer. She went on, her voice light, but each word set in place the way a jeweler sets a stone. The first time I saw you was at Sinar, last November. Family dinner. I was in the VIP room, and you were serving outside. I wouldn't have remembered you if something hadn't happened that night." She paused to catch her breath. Every breath was audible in the stillness of the room. There was a guest who had drunk too much. He started troubling the table beside him, talking loudly, laughing loudly, slapping his hand on the table. The family at the next table had a young woman with them who was deeply uncomfortable and didn't know what to do. The restaurant manager was standing at a distance, watching, and didn't dare come closer because that guest was a major business partner. She looked at Jolene. "You walked straight over. You said 3 sentences. I couldn't hear what you said because I was sitting too far away, but I saw his face when he stood up and walked out. He wasn't angry. He was ashamed." Margaret let that sentence hang in the air for a moment. Then she spoke, slowly, clearly, each word carrying weight. "A person who can make someone else feel ashamed instead of afraid. That is a kind of power that can't be bought. I have lived 61 years, Jolene. I have seen people use money to subdue, use power to threaten, use reputation to force. But to make a drunken man realize he is wrong with only 3 sentences, without shouting, without threatening, without calling anyone over, that is not something I have seen often." Jolene sat still. She hadn't known Margaret had been watching. No, observing her for that long. She felt as though someone had just turned over a page from a diary she hadn't known she had written. Margaret opened her palm. Resting there was a small silver bracelet, not elaborate, thin, the kind of bracelet someone wore every day, instead of keeping behind glass. "Take it," she said. "It's not an engagement gift. It's a welcome. You may wear it or not wear it. My son will be offended if you don't. I won't." Jolene accepted the bracelet. The silver was cool in her palm. So light she could almost not feel it at all. But she did feel it, because she was the sort of person who noticed light things, because all her life she had survived on light things other people overlooked. "Thank you," she said, and her voice, for the first time since she had entered this house, trembled slightly. Only slightly. Not enough for anyone else to hear, but Margaret heard it, because Margaret was the kind of woman who heard even the tremors people tried to hide. Jolene left. Reed walked her to the door. She didn't say much. She held the silver bracelet inside the pocket of her coat, and Reed didn't ask whether she would wear it or not, because in the past 3 weeks he had learned that Jolene Carter was not a woman who answered questions she hadn't yet finished asking herself. He went back upstairs to his mother's room. Margaret had closed her eyes, but she wasn't asleep. She opened them when she heard him shut the door. "My son," she said, "she will learn who you are, not the name on the business card, the name people whisper when they speak of you. The question isn't whether she will accept it. The question is whether you have enough courage to stand still when she sees that part of you." Reed didn't answer. Margaret closed her eyes again, and in the darkness of the room, the monitor kept sounding in its steady rhythm. Steady, steady, steady. Like a countdown clock both mother and son could hear clearly, though neither of them spoke of it. The coffee shop sat on a small street corner on the west side of Chicago, the kind of place with only 8 tables, a menu written in white chalk on a blackboard, and an owner who made every cup by hand. Jolene came because she had received a text message from an unknown number that morning. The message was short. "I'm Paige Whitmore. I need to speak with you. Not about Reed. About you. The coffee shop on the corner of West Randolph, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I'll be sitting at the table in the back." Jolene had almost deleted the message. She didn't know anyone named Paige Whitmore, but the surname Whitmore she had heard before. For the first time in her life, on the night Reed canceled his appointment in the VIP room to stay in the staff break room with her. The Whitmores. The appointment with the Whitmore family. She went. Paige Whitmore was sitting at the table in the back, exactly as she had said. The girl was a few years younger than Jolene, and she spoke with the bluntness of someone who had spent a very long time deciding whether to open her mouth at all, and now had no intention of circling around anything. "Do you know who owns this coffee shop?" Paige asked. Jolene shook her head. "Reed's cousin. His name is Trent Ashford. He left the family 3 years ago to open this coffee shop. The whole family treats him like a traitor. I think he's the bravest person I know." Paige paused. "Not for drama. To breathe. I'm going to tell you some things," Paige said. "I'm going to tell you facts. I'm not going to tell you what to think. You'll decide that for yourself." Jolene nodded, and Paige told her. Margaret Ashford, Reed's mother, had spent 2 years observing. Not observing one person, observing many. She made a list. 5 names, each name with a short note beside it. She wrote it by hand, on a sheet torn from a notebook. Plain paper, not expensive stationery. That list was given to Reed before the night he first came to Sonare. The first name on the list was Jolene. Jolene listened. Her face didn't change. Or if it did, it changed somewhere Paige couldn't see. That night, Paige continued, Reed was directed by his mother to go down to the staff break room. Not the VIP room, the staff break room. Margaret told him she had left something there. There was nothing there. Jolene placed her hands on the table. All 10 fingers spread out, then closed, then spread again. That was the only thing about her that moved. The appointment in the VIP room that night, Jolene said slowly, was with your family. Yes. My family and the Ashford family had an arrangement. Reed was supposed to marry me to merge the business territories on both sides. That night was the first official meeting. He canceled that meeting. Silence. The sound of the coffee grinder running at the counter. The sound of a spoon tapping against a glass at the next table. Jolene was fitting the pieces together. Paige could see she was fitting them together, because Paige was the sort of person who knew how to recognize when someone was rearranging the picture she thought she had already seen clearly. There's something else I need to say, Paige said. Not about the list, about Reed. She looked straight at Jolene. You know who he is, don't you? I'm not asking whether you know his name, which restaurant he owns, what he drives. I'm asking whether you know who he is. In this city, when he walks into a room, the whole room stops breathing. Not because he's tall or handsome, because people know he can change their lives with one phone call. I'm not saying this to frighten you. I'm saying it so you'll know what you're stepping into. Jolene didn't answer. She looked down at the cup of coffee she had not taken a single sip from since sitting down. Paige, Jolene said after a long while, why are you telling me this? Paige smiled, a tired smile, but not a bitter one. Because I know what it feels like to be arranged without anyone asking whether you want it. My family used the marriage to Reed as leverage. 4 seasons passed, and I sat through parties I didn't want to attend, smiling at people I didn't want to smile at, while the person I wanted to be beside was standing behind the coffee counter in this place. She looked toward the counter, where a young man in an apron was pouring milk into a cup with the concentration of someone who loved doing exactly what he was doing. Trent, Paige said softly. Then she turned back to Jolene. I never wanted to marry Reed. Not once. And Margaret, I think, knew that. I think that's why she wrote the list. Jolene sat still a while longer. She looked at Paige, looked at the coffee, looked at her own hand clenched tight on the tabletop without remembering when it had clenched. Thank you, Jolene said. 2 words, set gently on the table, the way she had set down her own name in front of Reed 3 weeks earlier. No further explanation. She stood up. She walked outside. The afternoon sun of Chicago slanted across the fronts of the buildings, laying long bands of light over the sidewalk. Jolene stood there on the pavement, and everything looked exactly the same as it had 30 minutes earlier, before she stepped into the coffee shop. The same street, the same sunlight, the same traffic noise. But the ledger in her mind had turned to an entirely different page, a page on which every entry she had written over the past 3 weeks, the callus on his hand, the new employee he had comforted, the coffee machine that had been replaced, the first cup of coffee in the staff break room, all of it was still true, still real, but now lit by a different kind of light. The light of a mother who had written 5 names on a sheet torn from a notebook and placed Jolene's name at the top. Jolene reached her apartment at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat at the kitchen table, opened her old laptop, and typed 2 words into the search bar. Ashford, Chicago. She didn't know what she was looking for, or rather, she did, but she wasn't ready to name it yet. Paige had said, the Ashford family, in the tone of someone trying to be gentle while handing another person a knife. The blade turned inward. A family, not a company, not a corporation, a family. And Jolene, who had lived 27 years in Chicago, who had worked every night in an Italian restaurant without ever asking who owned it, now sat in the darkness of her apartment and began to read. She read quickly. She didn't need to read much. The name Ashford appeared in articles about real estate, about major deals, about construction projects across the city. She skimmed most of it, because most of it had nothing to do with her, until she found an old article. It was from an issue published over a decade ago, in a small local paper, the kind no one read, except people searching for things no one wanted them to see. The article listed real estate projects invested in by the Ashford Group in the decade leading up to my father's passing. Jolene read the list. Her eyes moved across each address, each project name, each number. Then she stopped. 847 West Fulton. She read it again. 847 West Fulton. She read it a third time, because sometimes the eyes see something the mind refuses to accept. 847 West Fulton. She closed the laptop, stood up, walked into the bedroom, opened the bottom drawer of the wardrobe, where she kept a small cardboard box she didn't open often, because every time she did, it felt like reopening a wound she had spent 11 years learning not to touch. Inside was her father's death certificate. Martin Carter fell from scaffolding on the 7th floor at a construction site. Site address, 847 West Fulton, Chicago. Jolene held the death certificate in one hand. The other still held the box. She sat down on the floor, her back against the wardrobe, surrounded by old papers. Hospital bills turned yellow with age, letters from lawyers her family had never been able to afford to hire, and a small photograph of her father standing in front of a construction site, wearing a hard hat, smiling. Her father had fallen from the 7th floor of a project owned by the Ashford Group. Her father had died in an accident no one had been held responsible for. Her family had received no compensation. Her mother had collapsed, fallen ill. Jolene had left college, worked as a server, taken freelance design jobs, slept 4 hours a night, and written every debt into a ledger of survival. It had all begun at 847 West Fulton, and 847 West Fulton belonged to the name that sat across from her drinking coffee 3 nights a week. Reed had not caused the accident. He had been 20 years old when her father fell. He had not yet taken over the family. He might not have known. But the name he carried, the family he led, the empire his mother had built and he preserved, had let a construction worker fall from the 7th floor, then buried it quietly, then paid nothing to the dead man's family, then continued building other projects, signing other contracts, eating dinners in restaurants where the dead man's daughter was serving tables. Jolene cried. She didn't cry often. 4 years ago, when her former lover left her, she hadn't cried. She had laughed. She had laughed because if she didn't, she would have had to admit she had been wrong. And Jolene Carter didn't have time to be wrong. But tonight she cried. Not because of Reed. Not because of the list, the arrangement, the 3 weeks of sitting at a bar with a man his mother had chosen for him. She cried for her father, because the death certificate in her hand carried an address she had read hundreds of times over 11 years, and every time she had only seen a number and a street name, never the name behind it. Now she saw it, and it carried the name Ashford. She sat on the floor long enough for the tears to dry on her cheeks. Then she stood up, wiped her face with her sleeve, took the death certificate and went to her mother's room. Ruth was lying on the bed, her eyes closed, but when Jolene sat beside her, she opened them immediately, in the way of a mother who never truly slept while her daughter was not yet home. "What is it?" she asked. Jolene told her. Not about the list, not about Paige, not about the 3 weeks at the bar. She told only one thing. 847 West Fulton belonged to the Ashford Group. Her father had fallen at their site. Reed Ashford stood at the head of that family. Ruth listened. She said nothing for a long time. Her eyes looked up at the ceiling, then at her daughter, then at the death certificate in Jolene's hand. And Jolene realized her mother was not as surprised as she had expected. She was surprised, but not undone. Ruth had lived long enough to know the world was smaller than people believed, and the threads that tied one person to another were sometimes woven from things no one wanted to see. "Are you angry because he didn't tell you the truth?" Ruth said slowly. "Or because you had already started to like him before you knew it?" Jolene looked at her mother. "Both." Ruth nodded. Then she spoke, and her voice now was not the voice of a mother offering comfort, but the voice of a woman who had lost her husband, had been ill, had been poor, had watched her daughter leave college to wait tables, and had not lost the ability to look straight into the core of things. "The real question isn't whether he's sincere. The question is why he didn't trust you enough to tell you the truth." Jolene held the death certificate, folded it, and placed it inside her shirt, over her chest, where it lay against her skin like a small bone, sharp and cold. Jolene chose Millennium Park, Not Sonare, because Sonare was his territory. Not her apartment, because her apartment was where her mother lay, and she didn't want what she was about to say to carry through the thin wall between the rooms for her mother to hear. She chose a place that belonged to no one, a place with enough people passing through so she wouldn't feel cornered, and wide enough that she could turn and walk away at any moment without anyone stopping her. She texted Reed. 2 sentences. Millennium Park. 10 o'clock Saturday morning. Don't bring anyone. Reed arrived 5 minutes before she did. He stood beside a stone bench, wearing a gray coat, hands in his pockets, and watched her approach with the eyes of a man who already knew this conversation would not be easy, and came on time anyway. Jolene didn't sit. She stood across from him, 3 steps away, close enough not to raise her voice, far enough for him to understand she hadn't come to listen to explanations. Your mother made a list, she said. No greeting, no preface. 5 names, mine at the top. You got that list before you walked into the staff break room that night. Your mother sent you down there. There was no item. There was no coincidence. Reed didn't deny it. He didn't nod, didn't lower his head, didn't look away. He stood still, looked straight at her, and waited. You let me think you were lost on the wrong floor, Jolene said, her voice steady, but each word set down with the weight of something laid on a scale 1 brick at a time. You let me think you were a kind boss who happened to sit and drink coffee with a staff member. You let me offer you coffee from a broken machine. Let me talk to you the way I talk to ordinary people. Let me feel decent for treating you decently. You knew I was decent, and you stayed because of that. Reed drew a breath. When he spoke, his voice wasn't the voice of a boss, not the voice of the man at the head of a table in a room with no windows. It was the voice of someone setting down something he had been carrying too long. I was greedy, he said. For the first time in 7 years, someone spoke to me without calculation. Didn't look at me and start counting what I was worth. You sat there, on that broken chair, poured me a cup of coffee the whole floor had given up on, and talked to me as if I were a man who had wandered in by mistake. I wanted to keep that feeling. 3 weeks. I wanted to keep 3 weeks. Selfish. I know. Jolene listened. Her face didn't soften. She listened to the end, and realized the worst part wasn't what he had just said. The worst part was that she understood. She understood why he had done it, and understanding made her angrier, because it was 10 times harder to be angry at someone you understood than at someone you despised. The project at 847 West Fulton, she said. Her voice changed, not louder, not shaking, just deeper, as if this sentence came from another place inside her, a place older and heavier. Back then, during the height of the expansion, my father's name was Martin Carter. He was a construction worker. He fell from scaffolding on the 7th floor. That project belonged to a subsidiary of the Ashford Group. Did you know, Reed? Silence. The kind Jolene had learned to count. She counted. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I knew, Reed said. 2 words. His voice flat, but flat in the way a lake is flat just before a stone breaks the surface. My mother told me not to look you up. I knew you were a Carter, but I didn't want to open that door. I wanted to see the girl who didn't care about my last name, but eventually, I had to read it. And once I did, I didn't know how to tell you. All that time, Jolene repeated. You knew almost from the beginning. How many weeks did you sit and drink coffee with me after that? You listened to me talk about night shifts, about 4 hours of sleep, about my mother's hospital bills, and you knew the reason I had to live like that carried the name of the family you stand at the head of. Reed said nothing. His shoulders were straight, but something in his jaw shifted, as if he were clenching his teeth to keep something from breaking loose. You hid 2 things from me, Jolene said. Your mother chose me. Your family is tied to what happened to my father. Which one is worse, Reed? And Reed Ashford, the man who always had an answer. The man who sat at the head of tables in windowless rooms and made people forget how to breathe with a single question, stood in Millennium Park on a Saturday morning and had nothing to say. Not because he couldn't find the words, but because any word he chose now would be wrong. And he was smart enough to know when silence was more honest than any answer. I need time, Jolene said. She turned. She walked away, her back straight, her steps even, and she didn't look back. Reed stood beside the stone bench, alone, in the ordinary morning of a city that didn't know someone had just walked away from him in a way he had no right to stop. 10 days passed without Jolene seeing Reed. 10 days in which she went to work, came home, opened her laptop, took freelance jobs, slept 4 hours, woke up, and repeated it all again. For 10 days, the ledger in her mind gained no new entry, because she was too busy rereading the old ones under the light Page had turned on, and the death certificate had confirmed. She didn't call Reed. He didn't call her. The silence between them lay there like a blank sheet of paper both of them knew would have to be written on, eventually. But neither had yet picked up the pen. On the 8th day, Jolene finished her shift at 3 o'clock in the morning. She stepped out the front door of Sinare, pulled the zipper of her coat up to her throat, and saw a man waiting outside. He wasn't standing directly in front of the door. He was standing about 5 steps away, leaning against a lamppost, both hands in the pockets of his wool coat, looking like a man waiting for a car, or for someone, or for both. "Miss Carter," he said. His voice was gentle, polite, the kind of voice people used when ordering at an expensive restaurant, or when asking someone to do something that person did not want to do. "I'm Neil Whitmore. I think you and I should talk." Jolene knew the Whitmore name, Page's family. The other side of the marriage arrangement Reed had canceled. She didn't stop. She kept walking, and Neil Whitmore matched her pace, neither faster nor slower, keeping exactly 3 steps between them, as though he had already calculated that 3 steps were close enough for conversation and far enough that no one could say he was applying pressure. "I won't keep you long," he said, still in that same voice. Light, even, polite enough to turn the spine cold. "I only want to share a point of view. You have every right not to listen, but I think you should." Jolene didn't look back. She kept walking, and Neil Whitmore kept speaking, still 3 steps behind her, still in the tone of a man ordering dinner. "I know you're keeping your distance from Reed Ashford. Rumors move quickly in our circles. If you leave him, I think that would be the wise decision. For you, for your mother, for everyone." He paused for exactly 1 beat, then continued. "But if you go back, I want you to know that I will make sure everyone in this city knows exactly who you are. The daughter of Martin Carter, the construction worker who died at the site on 847 West Fulton, growing close to the man who now stands at the head of the very family that owned that project. How do you think that story will be told, Miss Carter? Do you think people will see you as a victim? Or will they see you as a woman taking advantage of a relationship with the man tied to her father's death?" Jolene stopped, not because she was afraid. She stopped because she was deciding. She turned and looked straight at Neil Whitmore. He was around 48, maybe 50, with the face of a man accustomed to smiling without ever truly smiling, and eyes that were too bright for 3 o'clock in the morning. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. She said nothing, because Jolene Carter had lived long enough to know there were battles where answering meant losing, and walking away in silence meant winning. She turned her back and walked on. This time she heard no footsteps following her. When she reached her apartment, she locked the door, took off her coat, and lay down on the bed without turning on the light. The ceiling above her was dark. Traffic passed outside the window. Her mother's breathing came steadily from the next room, the breathing of someone asleep. Someone who had no idea her daughter had just been stopped outside a restaurant at 3 o'clock in the morning by a man who had calmly laid out the exact price of stepping into Reed Ashford's world. Jolene lay there looking at the ceiling and thinking. She didn't think about Reed. She didn't think about Neil. She thought about herself. About the 27-year-old woman lying on a bed in a dark apartment, holding a decision for which there was no safe choice. To step into Reed's world was to step into a place where men waited outside doors at 3 o'clock in the morning and spoke in polite voices. To live in that place, she would need more than self-respect. She would need courage, and Jolene didn't yet know whether she had enough. 10 days passed without Reed calling Jolene. No text messages, no appearances at Sinare on Tuesday, Thursday, or Saturday. The chair where he always sat at the bar remained empty, and no one sat in it, because the staff at Sinare had started calling it the boss's chair, even though no one had ever told them to. Reed respected the distance Jolene had asked for, but respecting distance didn't mean standing still. On the 2nd day after the meeting at Millennium Park, Reed called his aide into the office and ordered the entire file on the construction project at 847 West Fulton, from the time of the incident, reopened. The file lay in the corporation's archives under a layer of dust, untouched since the day the project had been completed. Reed read it. He found the name of the site manager at the time, the man who had signed the decision to cut labor safety costs in order to save the quarterly budget. That man was still working inside the Ashford system, now a mid-level manager at a branch on the south side of the city, earning a decent salary, holding a stable position, living comfortably on top of a decision that, 11 years earlier, had caused a construction worker to fall from the 7th floor and never rise again. Reed fired him. No meeting, no explanation, no warning letter. Just one call from the boss's office, and the man had his termination papers before 5 o'clock that same afternoon. The aide asked what reason should be entered into the personnel file. Reed said, "There are debts that can't be paid with money." The aide wrote it down and asked nothing more, because Reed Ashford's aide was paid to understand that some answers were the whole answer and didn't need a second part. On the 4th day, Reed established a compensation fund. The fund carried no Ashford name, no Reed name, no name at all. Anonymous, routed through an independent law firm, paying the full outstanding medical bills of Ruth Carter, and providing monthly support to every family who had lost someone in workplace accidents at construction sites, funded by the Ashford Group during those peak expansion years. Not only Jolene's family, all of them. 7 families. Reed read every name, every case, every figure his family had buried in the archives and forgotten. And he did not forget, because Reed Ashford forgot very little, and from this point on he would not forget those 7 names. He sent the full documentation for the fund through Feldman, Ruth's lawyer. Feldman would be the one to tell Ruth, not Reed, because if Reed delivered the papers himself to Ruth, it would look like an apology, and Reed didn't want it to look like an apology. He wanted it to look like what it truly was, a debt paid 11 years late, one for which no apology would ever be large enough. So he did not apologize. He paid. On the 6th day, an envelope arrived at Reed's office. Inside was a copy of old debt papers bearing the name Martin Carter, Jolene's father, along with a small handwritten card. "Ashford, I think you should know what the girl you care about is carrying. See you at the gala." The handwriting was neat, slanting to the right, confident. Neil Whitmore's handwriting. Reed read the card. He didn't tear it, didn't crumple it. He set it down on the desk, picked up the phone, and called his aide. "Find me everything Neil Whitmore doesn't want anyone to know," he said. "Every transaction, every contract, every account. Don't rush, but don't be slow." Then he hung up and sat still in his office, looking at Neil's card lying on the desk beside the folded sheet of paper with the 5 handwritten names from his mother. 2 sheets of paper, one from a person who wanted to build, one from a man who wanted to destroy. And Reed Ashford, sitting between those 2 pages, knew exactly which side he was going to choose. He only needed time to choose the right way. Attorney Feldman called Ruth Carter on the morning of the 9th day. He spoke slowly, clearly, in the voice of an old lawyer who had trained himself to deliver important news, without letting personal feelings slip between the words. He explained the anonymous compensation fund. He explained that all of her outstanding medical bills had been paid in full. He explained the monthly stipend. He explained that 6 other families were receiving it as well. Ruth listened to the end. She thanked Feldman. She hung up. Then she sat quietly in her wheelchair in the small kitchen all day. She didn't tell Jolene. She didn't tell anyone. She sat in silence, the way a person does when weighing something on a scale no one else can see. And she needed quiet to hear which way it tilted. On the morning of the 10th day, she said to Jolene, "Call him here." Jolene looked at her mother. "Mother, call him here, Jolene. Not for you. For me," Jolene called. Reed arrived within an hour. He came alone. No aide, no driver. Driving a car Jolene had never seen him drive before. An ordinary kind of car. Not the black Cadillac of the family. He stepped into the small apartment. The apartment was clean, tidy, and plainly lacking in the way no amount of tidiness could ever fully hide. Jolene opened the door for him. She said nothing. She only led him into the living room, pulled out the best chair in the house for him, the only wooden chair with a cushion, then poured water into the least chipped glass out of the 3 glasses on the tray, and set it in front of him. Reed looked at the chair, looked at the glass, and he understood, without anyone needing to explain it, that he was being offered the best this house had, and that weighed more than any banquet he had ever sat through. Jolene set the glass down, looked at him for a moment, then said, "My mother wants to speak with you alone. I'll wait outside." She left, closed the door. Reed sat across from Ruth Carter. She sat in her wheelchair, a blanket over her legs, her hands resting on the arms of the chair, looking at him with a gaze Reed had seen only once before in his life, in his own mother. The gaze of a woman who had lost enough that she was no longer afraid of losing more, and for that reason had no cause left not to speak plainly. "I know who you are," Ruth said. "Not from my daughter. From the way Attorney Feldman fell silent when I mentioned the Ashford name." 5 seconds before he continued. 5 seconds, Mr. Ashford. He is an old lawyer. He has heard every kind of name in this life. And your name made him stop for 5 seconds. I don't need to read the newspapers to understand what those 5 seconds mean. She paused, not to catch her breath, to give him time to take it in. "I'm not afraid of you," she continued. "I'm afraid of the world you carry with you. The world where a man waits outside a restaurant at 3 o'clock in the morning to speak politely to my daughter." Reed sat straighter. Jolene had not told him about Neil, but Ruth knew. She knew because her daughter had come home that night and locked the door with both hands instead of one, and Ruth had lived with her daughter long enough to know that locking a door with both hands meant there was something outside Jolene did not want to let in. "I can't separate myself from that world, ma'am," Reed said, "but I can be honest." Ruth looked at him, for a long time, the kind of look people use when reading a contract line by line, word by word, searching for any hidden clause. "You created the compensation fund," she said, "not only for my family, for 7 families. You fired the site manager responsible for the accident. You sent the papers through Feldman instead of bringing them here yourself. And you haven't called my daughter for 10 days. She listed each thing in a flat voice, neither praising nor condemning, only arranging the evidence. "I have one question," she said. "Did you do those things because of my daughter, or because you can't bear to look at yourself in the mirror every morning?" Reed didn't answer at once, he thought, and Ruth watched him think, and she saw that he was truly thinking, not choosing pretty words. "Both, ma'am," he said. "I'd be lying if I told you it was only one reason." Ruth looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then she said, "Sit properly. You're sitting like you're about to jump up and run." Reed realized he was perched on the edge of the chair, his back stiff and straight, as if ready to leave at any second. He sat back, leaned against the chair, and Ruth nodded once, a small nod, as though he had just passed a test she had not warned him about. "2 conditions," she said. "First, you don't hide anything from my daughter anymore. Anything. Even if you think it will hurt her. Even if you think telling her will make you lose her. You do not hide it, because hiding is the surest way to lose her." "Agreed," Reed said. "Second, you come here 3 times a week. 1 month. If after 1 month my daughter still wants this, you meet with Attorney Feldman. He is cheap and honest. 2 things that rarely come together." "Agreed." Ruth paused. Reed waited for a 3rd condition. Ruth said, "The 3rd one I'll let Jolene speak herself. That girl knows how to protect herself better than I thought, better than I'd like to admit." She turned her wheelchair a little closer. Her voice softened, not into tenderness, only into something lighter, like a person setting something breakable down on a table. "And Mr. Ashford, don't promise what you can't control. Don't promise to protect my daughter, because you can't control the world you live in. Promise what you can control. Honesty." Reed looked at Ruth Carter. She looked back at him, and in that moment, Reed saw something he had seen before, in his own mother, in Margaret, in the woman lying in bed at the Ashford estate, with eyes brighter than her body. The same kind of strength, the kind possessed by a woman who has lost almost everything and still sits with her back straight, still sets conditions, still looks at the most powerful boss in Chicago and says, "Sit properly." "Honesty," Reed said. "That I promise." Ruth nodded. "Good. Now call my daughter back in, and drink your water. You haven't taken a single sip since you walked into my home." On the 11th day, Jolene went to the Ashford estate without warning. She didn't call Reed. She didn't text him. She took the bus, walked the last stretch, and rang the gate bell at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The gatekeeper recognized her, because the Ashford family's gatekeeper was paid to remember the face of everyone who had ever passed through those gates, and she was the one he had been told must never be stopped. She went straight to the 2nd floor. She didn't look for Reed. She walked to the white door with the brass handle, Margaret's door, and knocked. "Come in," Margaret's voice called from inside, smaller than before, thinner, as though each passing week was shaving away a layer of her, and no one could see where the knife was. Jolene stepped inside. Margaret lay in bed, in the same position, against the same mound of pillows, but smaller. Not smaller because the bed was larger. Smaller because she was losing more quickly than Jolene had imagined. Her eyes were still bright, but that brightness now resembled a candle in a closed room, more than a lamp on a desk. Still enough to read by, but the kind of light that made people know it would go out soon, and made them begin to read faster. "Jolene," she said. No surprise, no question about why she had come, as though she had always known Jolene would come, only not which day. "I have a question for you," Jolene said. She sat in the chair beside the bed, the same chair she had sat in last time, and she realized there was still a faint mark on the armrest from the last time she had gripped it, when Margaret told her the story about Cinare. She didn't grip it this time. She placed her hands in her lap, palms upward, and asked plainly, "Did you know about the project at 847 West Fulton?" Margaret didn't blink. A family trait. "I knew," she said, "before I wrote your name on the list." The room fell silent. Jolene could hear the breathing monitor sounding in its steady rhythm, hear the light wind outside the window, hear something inside herself arranging itself again, slowly, carefully, like someone setting a room back in order after everything in it had been overturned. "You knew the Ashford family was tied to my father's accident," Jolene said, not as a question. "And you still wrote my name at the top of the list. You chose the daughter of the construction worker who died on your family's project for your son." "Yes. Why?" Margaret drew in a breath. Every breath now was a choice, not a reflex, and she chose to spend this one on speech. "Because I wasn't choosing someone who forgives easily, Jolene. I was choosing someone who forgives at the right moment." She paused. Her eyes stayed on Jolene, and in that gaze there was something Jolene needed several seconds to recognize. Not pity, not calculation. Trust. Margaret had trusted her before Jolene knew she was trusted. "If you forgive my son," Margaret said, "he will never forget the cost of that forgiveness, and he will live differently because of it." Jolene sat still. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She had already cried in her own apartment, on the floor, among the old papers, and she had cried for her father. Those tears belonged to her father, and she wouldn't use them here, wouldn't use them in front of Margaret, because this was a different conversation. This was a conversation between two women deciding the future of a man they both loved in different ways. "You made a wager," Jolene said, her voice steady. Slightly rough, but steady. "You wagered that I would come here, that I would ask this question, that I wouldn't walk away." "I didn't wager," Margaret said. "I observed, for 2 years, and I saw a girl who made other people feel ashamed instead of afraid, who cared for her sick mother alone without bowing her head, and who laughed when no one else was laughing. A person like that doesn't walk away. A person like that walks straight in and asks why." Margaret reached out her hand. A small hand, thin, the skin so delicate that the blue veins showed beneath it. Jolene took her hand, gently, precisely, the way one holds something precious that one already knows won't be kept for long. "Thank you," Jolene said. "Don't thank me," Margaret said, and at the corner of her mouth there was the faintest curve, not enough to call a smile, but enough for Jolene to remember for the rest of her life. "Thank the cat. If it hadn't jumped into the trash that night, you wouldn't have laughed, and my son wouldn't have stayed." Jolene released Margaret's hand. She stood up. She walked out of the room, closed the door softly, and stood in the hallway for a moment, her back against the wall, her arms hanging at her sides, looking down at the cold marble floor beneath her feet. Then she went downstairs. Reed was standing at the foot of the stairs. He didn't ask what she had said to his mother. He simply stood there and waited, and Jolene realized he had been waiting there ever since she walked upstairs, because he knew she had come to see his mother, not him, and he respected her enough not to place himself between them. "I saw your mother," Jolene said. "I read the papers Feldman sent. I know what you did." Reed stood still, waiting. "I don't forgive the Ashford name," Jolene said. Her voice was level, but each word was set down with the precision of someone placing her feet on a wire with no net below. I'm trying to, forgive Reed. Those are 2 different things. Can you accept living with that difference?" "I can," Reed said. 2 words, no explanation, no defense, no added promise. Just 2 words, set down at the foot of the staircase like a foundation stone on which he meant to build everything else. Jolene nodded. She didn't smile. She wasn't ready to smile. But she didn't turn and walk away either, and Reed understood that, at this moment, was already more than he deserved. The sea-green gown arrived at Jolene's apartment on the morning of the gala, in a white box with no logo, only a small note inside written in a trembling hand. "Let the dress do the heavy work. You only need to walk." Margaret's handwriting. Jolene put the dress on, stood in front of the only mirror in the apartment, the small one hanging behind the bathroom door that forced her to step back 3 paces just to see half her body, and said, "I look like a fish." Ruth sat in her wheelchair at the bathroom doorway, looked at her daughter, and said in a flat voice, "You look like someone who's about to be stared at by 300 people, and half of them will hate you on instinct because you look better than they do, even though you didn't have the money to buy that dress. Walk slowly. Keep your back straight, and don't answer a question nobody asked." Jolene kissed her mother's forehead, picked up her purse, and left. Reed was waiting for her at the entrance hall of the gala venue. He was wearing a black suit, the kind of suit Jolene had seen him wear the first time in the staff break room. But tonight it looked different, or he looked different, or she looked at him differently. She wasn't sure which thing had changed, and decided not to examine it right now. "Jolene," he said. "Reed, if you say I look like a fish, I'm going home. I was going to say you look like the sort of woman who makes me forget my own name, which is a little inconvenient since the man announcing guests is about to ask for it. Then remember it. I'm not introducing you for you." He held out his hand. She took it, and they walked in. 300 heads turned. Jolene felt it like a physical gust of wind, 300 gazes falling on her all at once, 300 minds beginning their calculations at once. Who? From where? Wearing what? With whom? Worth how much? She didn't flinch. She had served 300 people in a single night at Sonare before. The only difference was that tonight she wasn't carrying a tray. They crossed the hall. Reed introduced her to a few people, briefly, without flourish. Jolene shook hands, nodded, said exactly the number of words required. No more. She was beginning to think the evening might pass without incident when Neil Whitmore appeared. He came from the left side of the hall, cutting across the edge of the dance floor, holding a glass of wine that Jolene guessed wasn't his first, because his steps were steady, but his eyes were not. Neil Whitmore's eyes tonight held that same brightness she had seen outside the restaurant at 3 o'clock in the morning. The brightness of a man who had drunk just enough to lose the last layer of control sobriety had been holding in place. "Miss Carter," Neil said, his voice polite, loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "What a pleasure to see you here. I hear you and Mr. Ashford have become very close." He turned to Reed. "Congratulations, Ashford. I do hope she knows that her father, Martin Carter, left behind a debt of $3,400, and I have the papers to prove it. The head of the largest family in Chicago spending his time with the daughter of a construction worker in debt. People will begin to wonder what exactly she's using this relationship to solve." Silence spread around them, not through the whole hall, only in a circle of about 10 steps. But 10 steps at a gala like this was enough for a rumor to reach the walls within 10 minutes. Jolene felt Reed's hand tighten beneath hers. He was about to speak. She squeezed his hand once, lightly, quickly, enough for him to understand. "Let me." Reed went silent. Jolene turned to Neil. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice calm, clear, the voice of someone who had practiced calm through 4 years of keeping a survival ledger and 11 years of caring for a sick mother. "You just said $3,400. That figure is wrong. The original debt was $3,400. But your father, before his death, accepted the repayment terms my father proposed. $25 each quarter, deducted from the net debt of $2,900, because your father also owed mine $500 from a card game he lost at the business club shortly before the accident occurred. I have copies of the papers. I always do." Neil stood frozen. The wine glass in his hand tilted slightly. "I'll offer you, publicly, in front of everyone here, the same terms your father accepted before he died," Jolene said. $25 each quarter, paid from my personal income, beginning next quarter. My lawyer, Mr. Feldman, will draft the documents. If you refuse, I will release the full file to the press. The letters between your father and mine, the card game, the agreement, all of it, under my name." The circle of silence around them had widened now. 20 people. 30. Neil opened his mouth, but before he could speak, Reed stepped up beside Jolene. He didn't look at Neil. He looked out across the room, his voice light, even, the voice of the man at the head of the table, the voice that made his entire business empire go still and listen whenever he used it. On that note, the Ashford Group has just completed a full review of all workplace safety records at our construction sites over that 5-year period. Some families were not compensated as they should have been. We are correcting that. Anyone with relevant information, our attorneys are always available. He didn't look at Neil. He didn't need to. The whole room understood. Reed Ashford had just publicly admitted his family had been wrong, stood beside the daughter of a victim, and turned the very weapon Neil had meant to use into proof that Neil was attacking a family. The Ashford Group was in the process of compensating. Attacking Jolene Carter now no longer looked like attacking a poor girl. It looked like attacking the public correction of the largest family in Chicago. Neil Whitmore looked around. He saw 300 faces. And on those 300 faces there was not one that stood with him. He nodded once, short and sharp. The nod of a man who knew he had lost, and had no way to lose that would make it look any better. And he withdrew. The crowd closed behind him the way water closes after a stone sinks. 2 days after the gala night, Neil Whitmore received the first call from the bank. His entire line of business credit had been frozen. That same afternoon, the lease renewals for 3 restaurants he owned in the South Loop were denied, with no specific reason put in writing. The following day, 2 suppliers of wine and food canceled their contracts. Polite, brief, with no explanation. There were no threatening phone calls from Reed Ashford. No messages. Nothing at all. Only silence. And that silence was eating away at Neil Whitmore's little empire day by day, contract by contract, unanswered call by unanswered call. That was how Reed Ashford replied. Not with words, with consequences. Paige Whitmore left the Whitmore family that same week. She moved in with Trent Ashford in the small apartment above the coffee shop on the corner of West Randolph. And no one in the Whitmore family called her, because no one had enough standing left to do so. But Jolene didn't know any of that on the night of the gala. Those things happened afterward. That night, after Neil withdrew and the crowd closed behind him, Jolene stood beside Reed in the middle of the hall, her back straight, her face calm, and said in a low voice only he could hear, "I need a glass of water, and I need to get out of here, because my knees have just decided they're no longer willing to cooperate." Reed didn't ask anything. He held out his hand. He led her across the hall, through a side corridor, into a small room beside the ballroom that no one was using that night, the kind of room meant for guests to rest between events, with an old velvet chair, a small table, and quiet. Jolene sat down. Both hands rested on her lap. Both hands were trembling. Not trembling badly, not the kind that had lost control, but trembling the way a body does when it starts giving back everything it has held in for the last 15 minutes. She didn't cry. Her eyes were dry. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm. Calm in a strained way. Calm in the way people are calm when they know that if they let go even a little, everything will break. "I was angry for 4 years, she said. She didn't look at Reed. She looked at her trembling hands on her lap. "I didn't know I'd been angry for 4 years until tonight. I thought I was finished with it. I thought I had laughed enough about it, written enough numbers into my survival ledger to bury it beneath debts and deadlines. But it wasn't a number, Reed. It sat in that ledger between my mother's hospital bills and next month's rent, and it sat there so long that I forgot it wasn't a number. It was anger. And tonight I spent all of it in 5 minutes, in front of 300 strangers, on a man who probably didn't deserve the full weight of it. But he was standing there, and he opened his mouth, and I had held that anger too long to choose a more precise target." She stopped, breathed. Her hands were still shaking. "My mother would say I was rude," she said. "Your mother would say I was brave." "You were brave," Reed said, "and slightly terrifying." Jolene looked at him. For the first time since Neil had opened his mouth in the ballroom, she looked at him, and she saw, at his wrist, where the sleeve of his jacket had pulled back slightly when he handed her the glass of water, a pulse beating much faster than normal. He had been calm all night. His voice had never shaken when he spoke in front of 300 people. But the pulse in his wrist didn't know how to perform, and that pulse told Jolene that his hands had lied all night, and all night he had been afraid, not of Neil, but of losing her. "Reed," she said. "Jolene, get me out of here." Reed didn't drive back to the estate. He turned left instead of right at the first intersection, and Jolene knew he wasn't taking her home, but she didn't ask where they were going, because tonight she had already asked enough questions, and she trusted him enough to sit quietly in the passenger seat and watched the streets of Chicago slide past the window. He stopped in front of Sonare. The restaurant was dark. It had closed at 11 o'clock. The facade was dark, the sign unlit, the front door locked. Reed pulled a key from his suit pocket, opened the back entrance, and led her through the dark kitchen corridor, past the dishwashing station, through the swinging doors that led down to the staff break room. He turned on the light. The fluorescent bulb flickered twice, then came on, that cold, white light Jolene had known through so many night shifts, the kind of light that hid nothing, flattered nothing, only shone on everything exactly as it was. The plastic table, the plastic chairs, the tile floor faintly stained in one corner, and in the corner of the room, the old coffee machine, the one the whole floor had given up on. It was still there, unplugged. Beside it stood the new machine, spotless, its waiting light blinking softly. But the old machine was still there in the corner, like a witness no one had thought to remove. "You kept it," Jolene said. "I kept it," Reed said. He didn't explain why. He didn't need to. Jolene looked at the old coffee machine, and she remembered that first night, the worst cup of coffee, the laughter over the stray cat, and the man in the suit, standing in the middle of the staff break room not knowing what to say. Then she looked back at him. He was standing in the middle of the room, in the exact place where he had stood the first time. But tonight everything was different. Tonight she knew who he was, knew what his family had done, knew his mother had chosen her, knew he had hidden things from her, knew he had tried to make things right, knew the pulse in his wrist had run fast when he was afraid of losing her, knew all of it. And she was still here. Reed went down on one knee, not slowly, not theatrically, with no music and no candlelight. He went down on his right knee on the tile floor of the staff break room, in the exact place where the first time he had sat in the broken chair and drunk the coffee she had poured for him. "Jolene," he said. "Reed, I want to be with you. Not as the head of the Ashford family, not as the owner of this restaurant. I'm the man who stands in a garage at midnight and planes wood." He raised his right hand. The palm, where the callus lay that Jolene had written into her mental ledger in the second week. The callus she had asked about, and he had answered with, "Old habit," and shut the door. "This is the callus," he said. "Not from signing contracts, not from driving, from planing wood. My father taught me how to plane wood before he died, before I sat in the chair at the head of the table that he left behind. Every night, when no one is looking, I go down to the garage and plane wood, because it's the only way I can remember my father without feeling that I'm pretending to be him. I hid this for 7 years. Because if anyone knew that the head of the Ashford family stood planing wood at midnight like an ordinary carpenter, then the image I spent 7 years building would crack. I waited a very long time before telling anyone. I'm telling you, because you're the only person I want to see that crack." Jolene stood still. Her hands hung at her sides. She looked at him kneeling on the floor of the staff break room beneath the cold white fluorescent light that hid nothing, and she looked at the callus in his palm. And for the first time she understood fully that he was not asking her with a ring or with some grand promise. He was asking her with the callus, with his final secret, with the softest part of himself laid before her on the tile floor, under fluorescent light, beside the old coffee machine no one had removed. "3 conditions," Jolene said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She smiled, and that smile trembled, trembling at the corners of her mouth, in the way only the truest smiles ever do. "First, never hide things from me with silence. Anything. Even the things you think will hurt me, because I'd rather hurt from the truth than be protected by concealment." "Agreed." "Second, let me keep my survival ledger. The ledger where I write debts, deadlines, hospital bills, everything I've needed to survive since I was 16. It reminds me who I was before I met you. I don't want to forget that person. I never will." "Agreed." "Third." Jolene paused. The trembling smile at the corner of her mouth grew still, and when she spoke the third condition, her voice was different, softer, deeper, as if this sentence came from the place inside her she had guarded most carefully. "Tell your mother every day, until she can no longer hear it, that she chose right. She deserves to know that. Every day, from tomorrow until the last day." Reed looked up. His eyes were wet. For the first time in this entire story, Reed Ashford's eyes were wet. "I accept all of it," he said. His voice trembled on the last word, but he didn't correct it, didn't swallow it down, didn't hide it. He let it tremble, because she had asked him not to hide anything anymore, and he was beginning now. Jolene bent down. She held his face in both hands the way someone holds something precious that they're afraid of dropping but not afraid of touching, and she kissed him, lightly. Once. On the tile floor of the staff break room, beneath the fluorescent lights, beside the old coffee machine, beside the new coffee machine, between those two things, between the old and the new, between the place where they began and the place where they were now standing. Outside the break room door, in the alley behind the restaurant, the stray cat meowed once, just once, as though it had waited for exactly this moment to confirm that everything had finally fallen into its proper place. The wedding took place in October, in the east garden of the Ashford estate, where the wooden fence Reed repaired with his own hands every weekend stood, and where Margaret loved to sit by her window and look out. Reed had pulled the carpenter's bench out of the garage and set it in the garden beside the guest chairs, because Margaret wanted to see it, and when Margaret wanted to see something, no one in the Ashford family asked why. Margaret sat in her wheelchair in the front row, wearing the silver-gray dress she had kept in her wardrobe for 9 years, the muted silver of a butterfly pinned in a glass case, beautiful and fragile, and quietly sad in the way only things saved for a single moment could be. A few distant relatives, long estranged, sat on either side, while Reed remained the anchor his mother had always relied on, silently, according to an arrangement they had made among themselves without saying it aloud. Ruth Carter sat opposite, in her own wheelchair, wearing a deep plum dress, her hands folded together in her lap, because Ruth had never liked anyone holding her hand, and she had no intention of beginning today. The ceremony was short. The minister spoke little. The October air in Chicago carried a chill, yellow leaves drifting onto the shoulders of the guests, and no one brushed them away, because no one wanted to break the quiet. Jolene's voice didn't tremble. She spoke her vows in a steady, clear voice, the voice of someone accustomed to reading difficult numbers aloud from a survival ledger without shaking. Reed's voice trembled on the second line. Not much, only on one word, but Jolene heard it, and she laughed. A short laugh, slipping out before she could stop it, like the first laugh in the staff break room when the stray cat got stuck in the trash. And Margaret, sitting 3 steps away in her wheelchair, heard that laugh and smiled. A small smile, the faint curve at the corner of her mouth Jolene had seen for the first time in the sick room, and never forgotten. Reed took Jolene's hand, turned her palm within his, and said, loud enough for the small garden to hear, soft enough to remain true, I love you. The first time he had spoken those words aloud, he had held them from the staff break room to Millennium Park, from the night of the gala to the tile floor where he knelt, held them until the moment when speaking them could not be mistaken for anything other than exactly what he meant. Good Lord, Reed, Jolene said, through a throat that suddenly refused to work properly. I love you too. Now kiss me before the minister faints. In December, on the night of the first snow, Margaret asked to be moved to the small room in the east corner of the estate, where the morning light came straight through the uncurtained window. She didn't want curtains. She wanted to see the first light of each day without anything filtering it. She allowed only Reed, Jolene, and her closest attendant into the room. No one else. One afternoon, she asked Jolene to read to her from her notebook, the notebook she had used for 2 years to observe, to record, to write her notes about the young women she had considered for her son. Jolene opened the page Margaret indicated, the entry about Jolene, the shortest note. Jolene read it aloud, her voice even, slow, like reading to a child before sleep. Margaret closed her eyes to listen, then she opened them, and she smiled faintly when she saw, in the margin of the page, beneath her own handwriting, another line written in a rounded, steady hand that was not hers. Reed's hand. He had added to his mother's notebook without telling anyone. She didn't read the line aloud. She only smiled. Then she closed her eyes, and she slept, and she did not wake again. Outside the uncurtained window, the first snow fell over the east garden, over the wooden fence, over the carpenter's bench. Reed had returned to the garage after the wedding, laying a thin white layer across everything, smooth, quiet, the way the passing of someone who has lived fully settles over those who remain. In spring, Jolene returned to the old apartment to clear the last of her things. The apartment was empty. Her mother's bed was gone, the wheelchair was gone, the steady breathing from the next room was gone, because Ruth had moved to the Ashford estate before Christmas, and Reed's doctor had confirmed that she was not dying, only exhausted, and that exhaustion was slowly lifting under the care of proper meals, a warm fire, and a daughter who no longer had to sleep 4 hours a night. The apartment felt smaller than Jolene remembered. She moved through each room, checking each drawer, each corner. Beneath the bed, where she had not looked for months, she found the survival ledger. The small notebook, cloth-bound, the corners worn, the first page marked with the date she began, the year she was 16, the year her father died. Jolene sat down on the floor. She opened to the last page, the page she had written before the wedding. The single line on that page was not a number, not a debt, not a deadline. It was a sentence, written in her own hand, taken from the letter Margaret had sent Reed on the 6th of April. The letter Reed had kept in his suit pocket since that day, and had never taken out until he let Jolene read it. My son, when you go to Sonare tomorrow night, don't carry your burden into the VIP room. Take it down to the staff room first. If you can set it down there, you won't need to carry it any farther. Jolene read it twice. She closed the notebook. She stood. How long have you been here? Reed stood in the doorway of the apartment, holding Margaret, their 3-month-old daughter named for her grandmother, asleep against his chest with the absolute peace of someone who knows nothing of the world and therefore has nothing to fear. Long enough, Jolene said. Long enough to be sure. She walked to the door, holding the survival ledger in one hand, and placed her other hand on the small back of baby Margaret, lightly, exactly where it should be, between the tiny shoulder blades rising and falling with her sleeping breath. On the last unpacked cardboard box in the corner of the empty living room, the stray cat sat. The cat from the trash bin behind Sonare on that first night. The cat that had followed Jolene to the Ashford estate on moving day because no one had the courage to tell her to leave it behind and no one wanted to try. It sat on the box, front paws tucked neatly, tail curled around its body, watching the three of them at the door with the calm gaze of a creature that had arranged this entire story from the night it jumped into the trash and decided to get stuck there. If this story has touched you, tap the heart and share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because next week, another boss is going to kneel, and the reason will be even more unbelievable.